descending over the North Base area. I have a chute. The pilot's out of the seat and the chute is good. Okay, Bravo, copy.
We had a highly competent team, very experienced, many flights under their belt. We had a number of pilots that flew the airplane. The pilot in particular that was flying that day had been on the program from the very beginning, highly experienced with the X-31.
Each mishap has its own set of circumstances and its own sequence of events. But you find similar issues: communications, complacency, assumptions that haven't been warranted, human frailties. And you have to account for these things in a program.
This is like a chain. You make a chain when you have any of these accidents, a chain of events. Any link of the chain, if it were broken, you would not have an accident.
This was the A-team. We had the best people from every discipline, from every organization, and we lost an airplane. So if it can happen to the best team, it can happen to any team.
The X-31 research effort began in the late 1980s as an international program involving DARPA, the U.S. Navy, Deutsche Aerospace, the German Federal Ministry of Defense, and Rockwell International. The program's goal was to explore the tactical utility of a thrust-vectored aircraft with advanced flight control systems, using an aircraft designed and built specifically for that task.
The X-31 was a real pioneering program. And in fact, the X-31 program pretty much wrote the book.
The initial X-31 flight tests were conducted at Rockwell's facility in Palmdale, California. But in 1992, NASA and the U.S. Air Force joined the X-31 research team, and the test flight program was moved to the Dryden Flight Research Center on Edwards Air Force Base. And before too long, the X-31 was turning in some extremely impressive results. By any measure, the X-31 was a highly successful program. It regularly flew several flights a day, accumulating over 550 flights during the course of the program, with a superlative safety record. And yet, on the 19th of January 1995, on the very last scheduled flight,
Their flight had been on the books for some time to get done, and it was, by our standards, an absolutely routine flight.
We were not expanding the envelope. We were not trying anything new. We were flying a new pitot-static tube, but this was in a routine mission, a routine task, routine flight environment with an experienced pilot and experienced crew.
But while the flight was routine, there had been some changes to the configuration of the X-31 since its initial flights. In particular, the original pitot tube, which supplies airspeed information to the plane's flight control computers, had been replaced with another kind of pitot tube known as at high angles of attack, but it was more vulnerable to icing, especially since the keel probe on the X-31 did not have any pitot heat.
We were never to fly the airplane in ice. That was a prohibited maneuver. So if you're prohibited from flying in ice, you don't need a heater.
Normally, the conditions at Edwards are warm and dry enough that icing or pitot heat isn't a concern. But January 19, 1995 was not a normal day.
The unusual part of the day was we had a high humidity at altitude, actually conducive for freezing conditions. And airplane was operated for in and out of some fairly high moisture content for with the air data system.
This particular airplane had a limit to not fly through clouds, through visible moisture. That day, we were flying very close to and occasionally in and out of very thin cirrus cloud. It didn't particularly worry me because everything seemed to be going along quite normally.
But some minutes, like 5, before the airplane went out of control and the pilot jumped out, the pilot observed that there was some moisture around where he was. So he turned the pitot heat switch on. Now clearly when he turned the pitot heat switch on, he expected that the pitot heat would be working. About 2.5 mentioned that fact to the control room.
Okay, remind me, I just put the pitot heat on. Remind me to put it off. Copy that.
We
ready?
The pitot heat's not hooked up on a kill probe.
Just stop it. You got enable on? Enable on.
Mysteriously, to this day, the control room gave him no response. They had an internal discussion as the clock clicked down, and internally it was commented that the pitot heat was not hooked up.
But this vital piece of information was not relayed to the pilot for more than 2 minutes. And even when it was, the information was not stated as clearly or strongly as it could have been.
And pitot heat. Well, leave it on for a moment. Yeah, we think it may not be hooked up. It may not be hooked up. That's good. I like this.
We had side discussions that should Instead, we pulled our headsets aside so that we could talk to each other because we were sitting adjacent to each other. And that's another part of just control room discipline that we broke down on.
Meanwhile, the first signs of trouble were beginning to appear.
So now the pilot sees an anomaly in his airspeed. He's at 20 degrees angle of attack, and he can see that. And he says to the ground, and I briefed this many times, he said, I'm at 277, I mean 207 knots.
And the airspeed is off, reading 277 knots at 20 AOA. Okay, pitch doublet.
Well, anybody that's been on the program, and lots of people have been on many years, would know that doesn't matter. It's not 207 knots.
Apparently, no one in the control room caught the possible significance of that discrepancy. And perhaps even more importantly, neither did the chase pilot, for the simple reason that he couldn't hear any of the pilot's transmissions.
We had a mechanism of hot mic, very important to the pilot in the X-31, that he'd be able to talk to the control room without having to press buttons at certain key times, especially at high angle of attack, which was not going to be a factor in this flight because it was going to go to about 20 degrees angle of attack. But it was a general operating procedure that was compounded because our hot mic system didn't work always very well. And when it didn't work, it put a lot of static in the earphones of the chase pilot who wanted to hear the hot mic to know what's going on.
So it was the one-sided nature of the communication that say, hey, I'm reading X knots and you guys are reading Y knots, and these two numbers should be the same, and they're not.
The X-31 did indeed have an air data problem. The unheated keel probe had frozen over in the